Amanda Frost, and I'm a professor of law at the University of Virginia.
Thank you for joining us. And we're going to be talking today about your book from about a year ago called You Are Not American, Citizenship Stripping from Citizen Stripping from Dred Scott to the Dreamers. And I'd love for you to begin by telling us how you came to the book and what you learned from it or what you got from it.
Yeah, so I had been both a professor of immigration law, which of course includes citizenship, and also a lawyer who represented asylum seekers and others trying to get legal status in the United States. And I thought I knew a whole lot about the US legal system when it came to immigration and citizenship. But then I, in the course of some research for various articles, stumbled upon some really shocking pieces of information to me, and I think maybe to some of my readers at least. Information such as the fact that U.S. citizen women lost their citizenship automatically upon marrying a non-citizenship for several decades in the early 20th century. Information about the battle for citizenship for African Americans in the wake of the Civil War, leading up to a citizenship battle over the seating of the first African American member of Congress in 1870. And all these stories fascinated me, and I thought that it was a story worth telling to a broader audience.
Well, and you do a great job in the book, and I recommend it to everyone who's watching. But I would love for you to kind of walk us through what citizen stripping is in the broadest terms. And then, because we have this idea, I think, that we're citizens by birth and constitutionally, protected citizenship. And I think that is more complicated than popular belief.
It is. So first, I'll start quickly by saying, well, what makes for a citizen or a U.S. citizen? So I think this is actually very well known, which is that if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen. And when I look at sort of polls or surveys of Americans, often people are not that knowledgeable about various constitutional provisions, but they're very knowledgeable about that one. It's really part of our culture and our identification as Americans that we know that if you're born in the U.S., you're automatically a citizen. But that was not always the case. That came to us from the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. It's one of the Reconstruction amendments. And it was in large part to overrule Dred Scott, the infamous decision in which the Supreme Court both expanded slavery, but also said no Black person, slave or free, could be a citizen. So it declared there was no birthright citizenship in the U.S. And the 14th Amendment overruled that case and said, no, if you're born in the United States, you are automatically a citizen. So that's the major way in which most of us become citizens. You can also inherit your citizenship from your parents. So if you're born abroad, but your parents are U.S. citizens, that's another way of getting citizenship. And a third way is through naturalization. So immigrants who come to this country, if they jump through various hurdles and live in the United States for 5 years, they become citizens. So the book, of course, is about citizenship stripping. That is taking away citizenship. And just as you said, I had this idea, this conception that no, if you're a citizen, you're always a citizen. That can't be taken from you. You could commit crimes and go to jail and be conscripted to the army, or a million other things might happen to you, but you can't lose your citizenship. And it turns out that's wrong. And of course, that's something, again, that the book I wrote it to make clear that we've done this in the past. And we, I think, need to be careful about potential to do it in the future. So I tell various group stories. It's often, with great frequency, about race, but not entirely. It can also be about political opinion. It can also be about our understanding of who we are. And I think that's the other theme of the book, which is, for me, this idea of taking away citizenship was part of a battle over Americans' identification of who we are and what it means to be an American. And of course, giving citizenship answers that question, the rules around giving citizenship, but the rules about taking away citizenship are also a part of that answer, and one that we've struggled with in our nation's history.
Well, let's begin with free Blacks and freed slaves, because as we know, our history, is founded on slavery, and everything we have to deal with in regards to citizenship really is under that umbrella of how did freed slaves become citizens, and then also how was that citizenship limited, because. And then we can also, I guess, get into the Confederate, ex-Confederates, but yeah.
Yeah, and I know you're doing this series as part of the 1619 project, and I just want to say that I fully embrace this idea that project brought to the forefront, which is this idea that, in fact, the Black population in the United States made us the democracy we are today, pushing at every turn to create us, to make us a better country because we weren't a democracy to begin with. And it was those battles that were so much at the forefront. And they certainly weren't the only ones, but they took the lead. And Blacks in America in the antebellum era fought hard for citizenship at every turn. Of course, they were also fighting hard against slavery. But there was the citizenship status of African Americans in the antebellum era was hotly contested, with some northern free states acknowledging citizenship, even giving some political rights, the right to vote, although there was plenty of racism there too. And the southern states, the slave states, mostly declaring no Black person could, even if free, could be a citizen. This came to the head in the Dred Scott case, where the question of citizenship was part of what the court decided. And as I mentioned before, the court, with Chief Justice Taney Redding, said no Black person, slave or free, could ever be considered a citizen, couldn't be part of we the people, which of course is the famous opening lines of the Constitution. And sort of horrifyingly, but in some ways accurately, he said, well, look at our framers. Look at the people who wrote the Declaration, who wrote the Constitution of 1787. So many owned slaves. It would be anomalous for them to say, for us to look at that document and say they meant for Black people to be citizens. However, I think while, of course, those framers were deeply hypocritical people, I think they also had hopes for a better future. I think Taney's reading was wrong in the sense that Black people actually ratified the Constitution. Some of them voted for it. And so the idea they weren't part of the we the people was wrong. But of course, we fought a war. We needed to do that over slavery. But 1865, the end of the Civil War, we saw this interesting situation that the United States had found itself in. Slavery was over, was abolished. 13th Amendment ended slavery in the United States, as did the war. But because of Dred Scott, Black people, now 4.5 million people, were living in the United States, but were not citizens. And that meant that the South, if it was reintegrated into the Union, would have more political power than ever before, because the infamous 3/5 Compromise Clause of the Constitution had counted every slave as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation in Congress. And that meant that the slave states had all this political power based on their slaves, who of course couldn't vote or exercise any role at all in the government. But with the end of the Civil War, ironically, the South would have more political power because the slaves would be counted. They wouldn't be slaves. They'd be counted as a person, no longer any slavery. So they would get more representation in Congress. But if the leaders of these southern states had their way, of course, the newly freed slaves would have no political power and would not be citizens. So that was the problem that the Reconstruction Congress dealt with. And they dealt with it through the 14th Amendment, where they said, and the 15th. And the 14th Amendment said that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. So they overruled Dred Scott and gave citizenship to 4.5 million African Americans. And importantly, they recognized that what they were doing went beyond the newly freed slaves, that it would apply to all the children of immigrants coming to the United States, including non-white immigrants. And they discussed this very explicitly. So that was a key moment in our nation's history when, if they hadn't done that, it really looked like we returned to a nation where we had slavery, maybe not in name, but in reality, in practical effect. Because if those 4.5 million newly freed slaves didn't have citizenship and political rights, they would have been all but enslaved again in a society that didn't respect any rights that they would try to claim.
And interestingly, because you mentioned in the book that it was a race to restore citizenship power, because after the Civil War, the planter class, the enslavers, were basically stripped of their citizen rights. So they couldn't vote, they couldn't basically vote. And the 14th Amendment specifically excluded people who were a rebellion against the Constitution, correct? And,
yes.
But that was quickly or methodically challenged, correct?
Yeah. So it was this sort of fascinating situation. Again, in 1865, we had the 4.5 million newly freed slaves who were not citizens. But the other people who weren't citizens, as I write about in my book, were what they're referred to often at the time as the slaveocracy, which is people like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, the leaders of the Confederacy, the men who owned these huge plantations and hundreds of slaves who'd exercised all the political power in the South. I mean, there's also the poor white Southerners who had almost no political power too, right? So it was the slaveocracy, these rich planter class that owned all the slaves, that had exercised all the power, that had seceded from the Union, that had fought the war, that were considered and were, right, traitors to the nation. And they had lost their citizenship. Men like Thaddeus Stevens, the leader of Reconstruction Congress from Pennsylvania, he said they're aliens. They're not citizens. And the southern states that fought to form their own nation, they have no role to play in Congress and cannot come back into the Union yet. They recognized eventually they would, but he said, so they couldn't vote. Robert E. Lee could not vote, couldn't hold office. That was initially under some of the laws in the Reconstruction Act that Congress passed in the wake of the Civil War, but then eventually in the 14th Amendment as well. Unless one of these leaders were pardoned, they could not hold political office. So they lost a lot of the rights of citizens. And in fact, quite a few also left the United States. And Lincoln had said famously before he died, we should send them all away from the United States, deport them, right? They're not citizens. They're not us. So that's why I describe in that first chapter of the book this race for citizenship. The Reconstruction Congress knew it had to give citizenship and citizenship rights to the newly freed slaves before the slaveocracy, the men who'd led the rebellion and fought for slavery, rejoined the Union in order to ensure that the political power in the South did not rest solely with those men. At first, they succeeded, but as we know, there then became a period of retrenchment and repression.
And then in the 1970s, they were basically given back their citizenship posthumously. Both Lee and
that story is so. I just really quickly, that story. It says so much about who we are as a nation in our more recent past, because Robert E. Lee died not gaining a pardon or a citizenship rights. Same for Jefferson Davis, and in the 1970s. So in my lifetime, the Congress gave posthumous citizenship to Lee and Jefferson Davis, and said things like what a great Americans they were. And the word slavery never got mentioned in those debates, which is just shocking. And Congress discussed it. And obviously it was just symbolic, but I think importantly symbolic.
Yes, exactly. And I'm glad we got that in there. I would like to move now to another, unfortunately, highly racist period of our history, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And maybe you could explain what that is, and more importantly, what it did to a whole group of people who were here coming back and forth, and the Chinese citizens.
Yes. And so I think this is actually a very important part of the story and takes us into the modern era of immigration and citizenship. I'll just say quickly as an aside that while certainly my book sort of leaves much to feel there's so much troubling in our history, and my book addresses that directly. But I just want to say there's also a lot of uplifting stories of the groups themselves who were targeted and the individuals targeted fighting back, and white American allies fighting for them too. So the book is not meant to be an entire indictment of the United States. It's a frank examination of our history, warts and all, and there are some uplifting moments. So I'll just say that. So the question of birthright citizenship and how it played out in the immigration era is fascinating, and the Chinese and the animus against the Chinese played a central role here. So the Reconstruction Congress in 1868 added to the 14th Amendment, added to the United States Constitution, the 14th Amendment, granting birthright citizenship. And that group, those members of Congress directly addressed the question, because it was raised. Wait a minute, will the children of Chinese immigrants born on the West Coast be citizens under this provision? And the answer was very clearly yes. And the nation voted and added that provision. So, of course, we saw growing anti-Chinese animus throughout the nation, particularly on the West Coast, but Congress then adopted the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which very explicitly said, limited Chinese immigration, and said no Chinese immigrant could naturalize or become a U.S. citizen, no matter how long they lived in the U.S. or their legal status as immigrants. So that takes us to a man named Wong Kim Ark, who was born in San Francisco's Chinatown to Chinese immigrant parents. And he was living in the United States most of his life. He worked as a chef. And he left for China to visit his family. His parents had moved back to China when he was about 25 years old. And when he tried to return to the United States a few months later, the government of the United States picked him as a test case to challenge birthright citizenship. So I just want to sort of focus everyone listening for a moment on the idea that the U.S. government decided to target this man, this entire group of people using this man's case, and say the children of, they want to say Chinese immigrants. That's clear. I've looked at the archive. They were targeting and had all their racial animus against the Chinese. But the 14th Amendment is written very broadly. So the position that the U.S. government took before this U.S. Supreme Court was no child of immigrant parents was a citizen of the United States under the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship provision. That is breathtaking. It would have undone the citizenship of many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, they had to put the oral argument in the case off until after the presidential elections because there were all these people voting and running for office who would not have been citizens had the government won the case. And I think it's relevant here to point out that the Solicitor General of the United States was a man named Holmes Conrad, who in his 20s had been himself an officer for the Confederate Army in the Civil War, and his family had owned slaves. And he clearly was opposed to the 14th Amendment, not just the birthright citizenship provision, but all of it. And he even argued before the U.S. Supreme Court that the 14th Amendment itself was unconstitutional, that the southern states had been coerced into ratifying it. And I presented this paper to lots of law professors all over the country and lawyers. And I ask every time, does anyone else know of any other time that the U.S. government argued before the Supreme Court that a provision of the Constitution was itself unconstitutional? And no one has given me an answer to that. So this may be it, right? He was refighting the Civil War in 1898 before the U.S. Supreme Court. And I have to say, he might have won that. I mean, this was a racist court with a whole lot of anti-Chinese animus. It had said a lot of very racist things. And I think the government lost the case 6-2. Wong Kim Ark was declared a citizen. And the court said the 14th Amendment means what it says. If you're born in the U.S., whoever your parents are, it doesn't matter. You are a citizen. But I have to say, I think that was because Wong Kim Ark's lawyers were pretty savvy. And they said to the court and to the nation in newspaper articles and interviews, you will deprive not just the children of Chinese immigrants of their citizenship if you vote for the government. You will strip citizenship from the children of English immigrants and Scottish immigrants and Irish immigrants. And the court could see the havoc that would be produced, and it didn't go there. So Wong Kim Ark saved the day, but possibly through these somewhat racist arguments that his own lawyers wisely, sagely made to a racist court.
And unfortunately, that didn't end Chinese discrimination or prejudice, and in some ways, made it even more fraught because as Chinese men came over, they were subject to these really draconian sets of inquiry and detention and paperwork and all that kind of stuff. So, but I'm glad you brought up the English and the Scottish and the French, because I'd like to move now into what suffragettes and white women found themselves facing as they won the right to vote and then trying to register to vote and found themselves up against a very particular set of circumstances. So that's a great story.
Yeah. So I love the story of Ethel Mackenzie, because she just strikes me as someone I wish I'd known. So she was a young, wealthy socialite, daughter, only child of a wealthy vintner living in San Francisco. A lot of the book, for very just sort of by happenstance, takes place in California and in San Francisco. And she, it seems, sort of was your typical socialite, not particularly focused on any political issues, but she then started getting interested in women's suffrage movement. And she became a leader. And she really was a leader in California. And California was a leader for the nation. California women won the right to vote about, I think, 9 years before the rest of the nation. And it's partly them getting the right to vote that led to the U.S. constitutional amendment in 1920 that gave women the right to vote across the nation. And she was a leader in that movement, and it was a very close vote. It was a squeaker. And, they had to, this is part of the uplifting story. Mackenzie and her fellow suffragettes had to convince the men of California to give them the right to vote. And they did. They did, for lots of reasons. Lots of political coalitions came together with self-interest, but also this genuine sense of, like, why shouldn't my sister or my daughter vote? The campaign said, give your daughter the same chances in life as your son. And there's lots of, interesting psychological evidence to show that men often can see sexism when they have daughters, and they want to change that for their daughters. So Ethel Mackenzie was very instrumental in helping California women win the right to vote. But then she herself goes to vote, and she's denied the right to vote by the registrar. She can't register. And the reason is she's married a non-citizen, a Scottish opera singer or ballad singer. He's actually himself famous. They were like the Kardashians of their day, I think, in the paper all the time. More substantive, I guess. But still, they were well known. She went down to the registrar's office to register, and I'm pretty sure she knew she'd be refused. She brought some press with her because she knew she was going to be a test case. And she was furious at this idea that she herself had just won the right to vote for California women, helped to do that. And then she was denied the vote and lost her citizenship. She also potentially could have been deported. And some women in her situation were, but she was saved. The government never tried to do that, but it was certainly a risk. So she fought all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. She, I'm sorry to say, lost her case unanimously. And the court said, well, tisk tisk, if you choose to marry a non-citizen, that's on you. That was your choice. So too bad, lost your citizenship under this federal law. I should say this was all under a federal statute that said women who married non-citizens automatically lost their citizenship, regardless of whether they were native born or naturalized or whatever their status. So she lost her Supreme Court case, but the battle was not over. And that's the important point here. So then there was a hearing before the Congress, and that hearing happened right before women got the right to vote in the Constitution. And the hearing is the all-male members of Congress are sort of laughing and belittling the women who are asking for their citizenship. And this was, I think, 1917 or 18. However, just a few years later, after women get the right to vote, Congress totally changed its tune. It's actually remarkable to see the way in which overnight, right, half the population that couldn't vote now can. And suddenly members of Congress are paying attention to their interests and needs. So they amended the law. They didn't end it entirely, however, in ways that are a little complex, but explained in the book. They continued to strip citizenship of women who married non-citizens ineligible to naturalize, and that meant non-whites. So if you married an Asian man and who was not a citizen and you were a citizen, you as a woman lost your right to vote, lost your citizenship and your right to vote. Whereas if you married a white non-citizen, you could keep your citizenship in the late 1920s. So the law remained, vestiges of it remained in a very racist fashion. But some people now didn't lose their citizenship any longer. So the happy ending to the story is a woman named Ruth Bryan Owen, who got elected, one of the very first women elected to Congress in 1928. She herself had lost her citizenship by marrying an English man and then gotten it back after he died. She reaches Congress. At that point, the law is only prohibiting citizenship or stripping citizenship from women who marry non-white non-citizens. But Ruth Bryan Owen, she's white. That doesn't stop her. She says, this is wrong. I'm not going to tolerate this. And she was instrumental in getting the last vestiges of that law taken off the books. So again, I just want to point out to the readers or potential readers that the stories are harrowing and upsetting and involve the racism of our nation that we struggled with since our founding. But there's also examples of people rising above the fray and seeing that the best interest of the nation, and indeed the only humane response, is to treat everyone equally. And she's an example of that. I should add that Ethel Mackenzie her husband naturalized so that she could get citizenship, and she got her citizenship too. So at the end of the day, by long and painful fighting, these people prevailed.
Yeah, and the story of Owen is really well done in the book, and I would have loved to have heard her making her case. It sounded like
she was clearly a firebrand too. She's the daughter of William Jennings Bryan, the famous 3-time contender for the presidency and himself a big political figure. And she was obviously an extraordinary woman in her time as well. So I love the characters in this book. They all interest me. Yeah.
Great. I think just for the sake of time, we're going to jump over kind of the ideological reasons why we could probably figure those out. Emma Goldman figures prominently in there, and how she is deported for her political activism. But I'd love to really jump into the Hispanic history and Mexicans in particular, because it's one of those histories that I think is known in parts of the country really well and not so much in others. And I would love for you to kind of walk us through how Mexicans fared as citizens and what new techniques were developed because of their immigration.
Yes. So the history of citizenship and immigration is so closely intertwined, particularly in the 20th century. And it's also intertwined with the cyclical up and downs of our economy. So we want workers, we bring lots of people in, then the economy, there's a recession or some sort of job shortage, and then suddenly the United States wants to expel people. So the history is very complex, and I can't tell it all. I don't in the book, and I won't here. But I will just say that there were two periods of time, two eras in the 1930s and then again in the 1950s, when the United States engaged in mass, they called it repatriation, but that's really not the right term, mass deportation of the Mexicans and Mexican Americans living in the United States. In the 1930s, it was, of course, inspired by the Great Depression. And it was very clear, keep American jobs for Americans, by which people meant white Americans when they said that. So there was a concerted effort among politicians in California to coerce or force or manipulate Mexican families. Often they were mixed families, maybe a couple of immigrants live legally in the United States, but then also U.S. citizen children or relatives. And they were, as I said, either coerced or forced into leaving the United States. And it was a very conscious effort to do so without allowing them to take paperwork that would show that they had a right to return. So the folks that I focus on in that chapter of the book, they had to find a way to prove they'd been born in the U.S. and that they were citizens because they hadn't been allowed to take their birth certificates or any documentation. And indeed, as the archives show, that was the goal of many of the legislators and executive branch officials who put into place this program. And so huge numbers of people were deported in the 1930s and again in the 1950s, forced into Mexico. As I said, repatriation is what it was called, but as the people that I follow in the book, they were born in the U.S. They'd never even been to Mexico, and they were forced into a country, back to a country they'd never been to, and made their way back into the United States. So, I mean, that is also a part of our history, and it's a good example of who's viewed as American. Of course, they were born in the United States. The birthright citizenship had been the law of the land since 1868. But the U.S. government did not view them as American in the same way that it would view a white person as American. And that is what led in part to this mass deportation of people that were U.S. citizens.
Yeah, and that brings up something I want to tie the Chinese chapters and the Mexican chapters together in that, there is this bureaucracy that develops to strip people of their citizenship, but then people are coming here illegally. And sometimes by mistake, a misprint or whatever, and sometimes intentionally. And that's the complicating piece of this, underneath the very blatant racism that existed. So maybe you could talk about paper sons and and how these systems encourage this kind of
So that brings us into this more complex and nuanced citizenship stripping that occurs in the later 20th century. So as I said, immigration and citizenship are really intertwined. So I'll go start with the Chinese. So the United States at first welcomed Chinese immigrants. They built the Transcontinental Railroad. They mined for gold in California. They did so much of that brutal labor needed to basically work on the frontier of the United States, and they were welcomed at first. Then with economic downturns, et cetera, there was a lot of anti-Chinese animus based on racism and based on economic struggles. And so that led to, okay, we're going to restrict Chinese from immigrating, just the Chinese, nobody else at that point. Now we have lots of limits on immigration, but for the first 100 plus years of our nation's history, it was only anyone could come, except in 1882, not the Chinese. So that led to a number of different things happening. One is certainly people came without authorization. People came, they made every effort, right? And you're always going to see that. You see that today. I think any of us can imagine you're desperate, you're starving, you have children, you do what you want, you can do for your family, right? So some came without permission. Others claimed to be birthright citizens because that was one way in, and or claimed to be citizens of children of a citizen themselves. That was the paper son phenomenon, and there was plenty of that going on with the Chinese community. Mei Nai, the historian at Columbia, and Erica Lee, who's now at Harvard, both are leaders in uncovering this archival research. And there were lots of examples of people doing what they could to manipulate the system. And I think their idea, and there's some archival research to support this, is these are people who said, you've taken away our legal right to come. It's clearly based on our race, right? Every other immigrant can come to the U.S., but I think something like a quarter of Ireland immigrated to the U.S. when they were starving. There were no laws limiting them. And I think these Chinese immigrants and would-be immigrants that, I'm faced with a racist bureaucracy and a racist law, I'm going to come into the United States anyway. So what's interesting is, we're afraid now of the newly arriving immigrants at our border. And by we, I just mean sort of as a nation, not everybody, certainly not me, but a lot of people claim that kind of fear. But when we look back, Are we sad that the Chinese immigrants came to the United States? No, right? I mean, they were instrumental in building our nation, and it's an immigrant population that has flourished so well in the United States that there's Supreme Court cases challenging the failure to admit them at higher rates to universities because it's such a successful group. So the idea that this was a mistake and that these people violated our laws and therefore came in a way that was a mistake is itself laughable today, and I hope we can learn from that. But citizenship then, of course, became a question of the government constantly trying to police the citizenship of this group of people. I should add here that there's plenty of examples of illegal immigration by children of Europeans as well. And actually, a colleague of mine has just edited a book of these stories. So there's a lot of thought, oh, well, some Chinese immigrants came in illegally, and there was an effort to police that and prevent that. True. But Irish immigrants came in illegally too, as did Germans and Hungarians and name your group. In various ways, as the law was more restricted, people found ways around it. But those groups were not policed in the same way, as your question noted. It was if you looked Asian that you were stopped and questioned and potentially deported. And something I uncovered in the book, and it was a sort of a moment for me because I did a lot of archival work for this, and this was a real discovery that I just looked into. Wong Kim-ark, the named plaintiff in the case that established birthright citizenship, the one person in the U.S. that the Supreme Court had declared to be a citizen, himself was arrested and nearly deported 2 years after he won his case. He was living near the border at Texas, and immigration officials just saw him, just assumed he was illegally in the United States, and put him in jail. He had to pay bail and then find a lawyer and prove he was a citizen. He said, I'm the Wong Kim-ark who won the Supreme Court case. So that's an example, right? Whereas you had maybe an Irish immigrant who was not legal walking around in New York and no one was policing their behavior. So that takes us to the Mexican immigrants from South and Latin America, who similarly were policed in the past, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and still today. And there's some stories in the book of people who live near the border today with Texas, whose citizenship is questioned, whose immigration papers are questioned, who have to walk around with their passport or their birth certificate in their pocket to prove they're a citizen. And I don't know about you, but I don't have anything on me right now that says I'm a citizen. I mean, I have a license, but that's not the same as saying you're a citizen, at least in some states. I don't carry my passport. I don't carry my birth certificate. No one has ever questioned my citizenship, but, we can imagine why. So that is still a problem today, both mistaken deportations, lots of people being stopped and questioned, and this general sense of maybe you're not an American, and that question only being asked of certain groups that obviously mostly based on race and some other forms of discrimination as well, including linguistic discrimination and socioeconomic class always plays in as well.
Well, that leads me to my kind of final question, which is, where are we today? And having seen this history and researched it, how similar do you think these threads are? Have they continued? What has changed? Is it better, worse?
Yes. Well, so no question better. And I do think that's an important message to give. I think that doesn't let anybody off the hook today. But I think there's no question that we have come a ways as a nation, partly because we came from a really poor place. We're not living in a society that says slavery is good for the slaves, which is, I've been reading a lot about people saying that in the 1840s. So we're better. Doesn't mean we don't have a whole lot of room for improvement, but I'll stop first and say we're better. The second is some of this still happens in maybe a more nuanced form, as I was just describing. The fact that a 17-year-old was arrested and held for a month, who was going to a soccer tryout in southern Texas because he didn't have the right paperwork on him, is just an example of that. That happened just a couple of years ago. And there's a scholar who studied this who says about 1% of the population in the Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention, that is people being detained by immigration officials, about 1% of those people are U.S. citizens, which is, a small percentage, but it adds up to thousands of people a year. And that's troubling just in and of itself. There's also the question of just feeling like people don't belong. People aren't considered to be truly Americans, even if their citizenship isn't legally questioned. Are they excluded in various ways? And that's something that I think our nation still struggles with and is still with us today. There was some effort to require proof of citizenship to vote. And of course, you do have to be a citizen to vote today. Didn't always used to be true, but fine, we have it today. But who's being asked to produce those documents and how hard it is to get them and how much does that lead to disenfranchisement? That's another problem that is more modern problem or example. But the final thing I'll say is we hear lots of presidential candidates, including our former president, say that we should end birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants. And that's why I think it's really important to acknowledge the importance, the history of birthright citizenship, and to celebrate its place in our society. I'm writing a second book on the history of birthright citizenship that is a celebration of what I think is a uniquely American idea. It's literally what makes America American is birthright citizenship. We are a little different from other nations in our pure birthright citizenship rule, but it is very much connected to our history as both a nation that enslaved people, then freed them and gave them rights, and a nation that is a nation of immigrants. And that's why birthright citizenship is so important to the United States of America, and is something that I think we need to elevate its status and its importance and the dialogue around it, because we do see it being attacked by various political leaders today.